Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started this afternoon. I am Larry Scogan. It's my good fortune to be the president of Bismarck State, and I certainly want to welcome all of you to our campus and to our beautiful new facility. And for those of you that have come to these things regularly, you can see we're experimenting a little bit here with the staging. We did it here in the Bavendick Stateroom in the National Energy Center of Excellence last time, and there were a number of folks that said they couldn't see us, and I don't know why that matters. It's not like we're eye candy, but anyway, folks said they couldn't see us, and so we're experimenting a little bit with how you're sitting in here and how we're sitting, and they've elevated the stage, and we hope we can make this more comfortable for you as we go on. Dusty Anderson, our technological guru, tells us that this is the best facility for the streaming and for the taping and all that sort of stuff. We've got all the technology here, and he doesn't have to move it over to the Sidney J. Lee Auditorium. So that's the reason that we're here, and we certainly appreciate your feedback. If you have some suggestions for this staging or the seating or whatever, please let us know, and we'll certainly try to accommodate that. Now, I'm very excited. We're really going to have a wonderful presentation today. I've seen a preview of it, and once again, Mr. Jenkinson has outdone himself.
You know, Larry, let me just say about this. First, I mean, a number of things. First of all, I feel a little...
The roast is over, by the way, before you say anything.
I was going to say that we had a roast of President Scogan here on Thursday night, and that was great fun. Some of you were here for that. And then this morning, I gave a talk at the Unitarian Universalist Church, and now we're talking again, and even I'm sick of me, and and that's bad, you know, because I can go for a long time without being tired of talking.
Hear, hear.
And this is going to be fun, because I'm going to ask you a lot of questions this afternoon. We'll see how that works out.
No, it won't.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, I'm delighted to be here, and you look dapper, as always. I think you put in your contract that you insisted that the stage be higher. I thought that was low.
Yeah, that was so. So anyway, well, I was going to introduce Clay, but he's already taken the show here. So let's get into our topic then. I think you all know Clay Jenkinson.
We're glad you're here, and thank you for coming out this afternoon. It's a day when the NCAA is a very big deal in America, and everyone is thinking about spring, and I'm just always so surprised that people will come to hear this stuff, and I'm very honored that you do, and so please linger and tell us what you like and don't like. But I'm so interested in this topic, and it really, I want to start by sort of stepping away from it for a moment. We're going to talk about the current legislative session, and really Dave Thompson's going to do the bulk of the heavy lifting on that, but we wanted to put it in the context of the history of the North Dakota legislature. And I want to say, having looked into this, there is almost nothing written on this subject. You know, normally if the subject is Garrison Dam or Indian reservations in North Dakota or the Battle of the Little Bighorn or whatever it might be, you can go find a lot that's been written. This is a very under-examined subject. And I've gone to the usual sources: Robinson's History of North Dakota, D. Jerome Tweeton's History of North Dakota, the more recent school histories of the state, websites, etc. And we need so many things in North Dakota. And here we are now, the richest state per capita. And although the legislature is spending, in some people's views, wildly, we still have this gigantic and accumulating surplus, not to mention the legacy fund. And when you look around at North Dakota studies, literature written about North Dakota and by North Dakotans, or historical studies of North Dakota, we're beginning to fall really behind. If you compare North Dakota to Montana, or to Minnesota, or even South Dakota, we don't have as vibrant a literature, and we don't have nearly as exhaustive a historical literature. And so, for example, we need a history of the North Dakota legislature. It would not be an easy thing to do, but the materials are there. newspapers. There's a synopsis of legislative activity from each of the sessions, going all the way back to the beginning at the North Dakota Legislative Council. We needed a biography of Bill Langer. We need a biography of A.C. Townley. We need a biography of William L. Guy, of Arthur A. Link, of Alan Olson. It's a little early, perhaps, for Ed Schaefer and John Hoven and Jack Dalrymple, but their time will come. There's so much, and I don't mean to be critical of anyone, it's just that there isn't enough of this sort of activity in North Dakota, and so there's really a dearth of an understanding of ourselves and how we got to this point. And I am no expert on this, as you'll see. I've just tried to cobble together the themes of our legislative history, but if somebody spent a year going into this, there could be a really extraordinary book on the history of the North Dakota legislature.
You know, Clay, if I were, and I'm a historian, if I were a practicing historian and were on the faculty at UND or NDSU, it seems to me that this is an area ripe for a good graduate student to really sink his or her teeth into and to do some original contribution to history.
Well, you know, this building is part of a center of excellence, right?
Yes.
Explain how that works.
Well, Governor John, I was going to say Senator Hoven, but at that time, Governor John Hoven created the Centers of Excellence program, and then each institution could apply, come up with an idea, and then apply and get partial state funding. So my predecessor, actually, Donna Thigpen, applied for that, got a Centers of Excellence grant, and then we've just been building on that.
Where are some of the others in the state? I mean, UND has them. Other institutions have them.
Yes.
And the point
Every institution has one.
And the point I'd like to make is that we should take a chunk, a small piece of this gigantic windfall, and create a Center of Excellence for North Dakota Studies, where we would give scholarships to young North Dakotans, or others, but to young North Dakotans to get advanced degrees, MAs, PhDs, MFAs, and so on, and then to give a portion of their lives to studying North Dakota. Mm-hmm. And sort of like the Peace Corps or some of the medical training programs we have around the country that give people scholarships but then encourage them and sometimes require them to spend a portion of their life living in a certain place and doing a certain thing. We're not lacking in smart young people in North Dakota. What we're lacking is a coordinated attempt to do this kind of work. And I think it would be, especially at a time when our state history and our state character are being challenged as never before, it would make so much sense to give $10 million, which is nothing, to a North Dakota Center for Excellence for North Dakota Studies. And that would create a whole cadre. You know, the greatest living North Dakota historian is D. Jerome Tweeten, who is now at the end of a long and distinguished career. Kimberly Porter up at UND does North Dakota Studies in some part. Tom Esern at NDSU. Some people here on your faculty, Perry, does some of this, Perry Hornbacher, but there are not enough. When I was growing up, there were 10, 15, 20 North Dakota historians, and now we're down to just a handful, and that's not good for us. So anyway, well, we're stalling, right?
You're stalling. Let's get into the topic. Before we do, though, I'm going to ask a question. I recognize some of them, but could we have a show of hands of all the people that are current legislators or former legislators here in the great state of North Dakota? Okay, we've got a couple. Okay, well, thanks for joining us.
Watch what you say.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, just a couple of little statistics first. There are 4 states and 4 states only that do not have an annual legislative session. In 1960, when Bill Guy became the governor of North Dakota, only 19 states met annually. 19 in 1960. Today, 46 states meet annually. The 4 who meet every other year are Montana, North Dakota, Texas, and Nevada. Texas sort of surprises me. It's one of the largest states, 25 million people. You would expect them to meet every year, but they meet every other year in Montana, Nevada, Texas, and here in North Dakota.
All in the west.
All west of the Mississippi. Nevada is another bit of a surprise. Montana and North Dakota make a bit more sense, but all the others of those 31 have moved to annual meetings. We have a citizen legislature in North Dakota, as you know. No North Dakotan could live on the stipend and the honor and the per diems of being a North Dakota legislator. Of the 50 states, 6 have very part-time legislators: Montana, New Hampshire, North and South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. Those 6. 11 more have legislators who work half-time or less. That doesn't count all the reading and thinking and prep and talk time, but actual sessions. Then about half of the states have legislators who work about 2/3 of the time on public legislation. 6 states have almost full-time legislatures: Illinois, Ohio, Florida, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Wisconsin. And there are just 4 truly full-time professional state legislatures in the country: California, Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania. So we belong to a very small club of 6 states that have extremely part-time legislators, citizen legislators, and we're one of 4 states that meets once every 2 years.
Now, before we just say that, the interim committees work very, very hard.
They meet off and on throughout the year.
So that they're really, it's not just once every 2 years they come together. Once every 2 years they come together in a session, but then they have these interim committees.
But they're citizen legislators in this sense. We do not pay them enough so they could possibly devote all of their lives to this. They have to be school teachers and lawyers and doctors and nurses and plumbers and farmers and ranchers too, because we deliberately have created a citizen legislature. Right. Then of the legislatures that are now in place, the 50 state legislatures, interestingly enough, 29 of them are Republican dominated. 19 of them are Democrat dominated, and 2 are split, Kentucky and New Hampshire. So we're living in a time when there is pretty emphatic Republican domination of state legislatures. North Dakota 71-23 in the House, 33-14 in the Senate. The only surprises in these, in the Republican list of 29, 2 that surprised me a little: Texas. You might have thought that Texas, with its size and its huge immigrant population and Hispanic and African-American population, might be split, as some are, but no, Texas is Republican in both houses, and Wisconsin is a little bit of a surprise. The bigger surprises are on the Democratic side. Here are 4 states that you might not automatically expect to be Democratic: Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, and West Virginia. So I find that really interesting. 29 Republican dominated, 19 Democratic dominated, 2 split.
West Virginia's not that surprising, do you think?
Not to you?
No.
Okay.
You can't drive through West Virginia. Every town has a Robert C. Byrd Bridge, Robert C. Byrd School Building, Robert C. Byrd Interstate Section.
He brought home the pork.
He did.
Okay, now I just want to talk briefly about the themes of the North Dakota legislature. And again, Dave will come up later and correct all of this. But as I looked through reading everything I could, I had really interesting conversation with Lee Calder, who's a historian of this, and he gave me a lot of the information that I have. But here are the themes that sort of stand out, the perennial themes of North Dakota life. Colonialism. We've always believed that we are a colonial state that is being exploited by outsiders. This is part of the populist movement. It was part of the Nonpartisan League, part of the New Deal, and now again, people are raising these questions. But one of the perennial problems of North Dakota is how do we maintain a viability without being a colonial vassal of interests in Minneapolis or Chicago or somewhere else, Houston or Tulsa. Secondly, how do you protect the family farm? As you know, North Dakota is essentially the only state with a family farm protection law. It's one of the last states to really work hard to protect the family farm against corporation farming or family corporation farming on a big scale. Out-migration. When you look at the history of North Dakota, it's just shocking. I'll come back to this in the PowerPoint, but in 1930, our population peaked at 680,000. And since from 1930 until 7 years ago, the population declined in North Dakota. We have been facing the problem of out-migration from the 30s on. And in the 1930s, 88,000 North Dakotans left the state and never came back. That was the greatest single hemorrhaging of our people. But it happened to a certain degree in the 60s and 70s, and then it heated up again in a huge way in the 80s. Out-migration has been, until now, the issue. It's still the issue in some parts of North Dakota, and we still lose a lot of our young people who grow up, get educated, and go somewhere else. But it was an acute issue between 1930 and 2005. Another one is sort of a more spiritual, mystical one, but where does North Dakota fit? How do we fit in the larger matrix of the Union? How do we fit socially, educationally, in crime and punishment, in our culture? And you can even see the current legislature's deep interest in abortion legislation is trying to figure out where we fit in the larger national mix of all of this. Another big issue that's been in place almost from the beginning, how can we afford to educate our children? You know, most of North Dakota history has been the history of a very spare treasury with not enough money to do even basic things. And the one basic thing after, you know, a judicial system and highways and so on that a state does is educate its children. And for much of our history, the bulk of the debate in any legislative session is how are we going to fund education and how are we going to equalize the funding of education between large places and small places and so on. Just two more. How do we diversify our economy so that we are not utterly dependent upon agriculture? And then sort of the Eric Sevareid question, how do we overcome North Dakota's historic isolation? Sevareid famously, he's from Velva, Sevareid famously said North Dakota is a blank rectangle in the nation's consciousness, tucked away, out of the way. And so the biggest question from 1889 until around 1990 was how do we overcome that very significant isolation? And now we have overcome it to a large extent. We have more mobility amongst North Dakotans than ever before. We have airports that can take you anywhere in the world within a single day. We have great highway system. We have the internet. We have cable television and so on. So the things that made North Dakota an incredibly isolated place in 1919 or 1939 or 1959 even have largely been answered by technology and infrastructural investment. And some legislatures, for example, in the 80s and 90s, invested heavily in connectivity to connect all of rural North Dakota so that we would be part of the digital revolution in a big way.
But even until a couple of years ago, we were still considered the flyover state. When people talk about North Dakota, the closest they ever got is flying over from Minneapolis to someplace else.
I'm not suggesting people want to come here. I'm just suggesting we now are connected to the broader world.
No, I understand. Yeah. Understand.
So anyway.
You've got a beautiful PowerPoint here. I think you ought to.
So here's the Capitol. I took this picture last week.
Which Minnesotans can only envy, by the way. That's
right, Larry. I love our Capitol.
I do too. It's a beautiful building.
I think we have a marvelous Capitol. This is, of course, one of the houses. But I just wanted to go through these phases, and I'm going to ask you to comment as we go along.
Be careful.
We'll just see. Okay. Phase 1, establishing the state, 1889 to 1903. And we faced the same problem that every state faced, beginning with the 13 original states and then moving on after the Revolution. And that is once you're constituted, the Constitution doesn't solve all problems. It creates a broad brush of how to manage public affairs. And then the first couple of legislative sessions have to do the hard work of defining what institutions are, defining what the duties of state officers are, defining the whole minutiae of the structure of government. And North Dakota is no different from any other. The first two sessions were heavily invested in taking the broad strokes of the Constitution and giving them muscle and specificity for state institutions.
Before you get off that, maybe you'd like to comment, and this is sort of a Thomas Jefferson question, but you know, I've always believed that the way that our Constitution set up the fact that we could incorporate states into the Union and bring them in as equal partners for the first time, I believe we were the first people that actually figured out a way to absorb colonies. Because in effect, territories are colonies. We just didn't call them colonies. So territories are colonies, and then once they reached a certain population and wrote a constitution, they could apply, and then they could become equal partners. I mean, so the colony of Dakota Territory ends up sending 4 United States senators to Washington, D.C. in 1889.
That's a good trick. We got two states. Well, Jefferson is the man who did this. In 1784, Jefferson was a national congressman from Virginia, and he devised something called the Plan for the Government of the Western Territories. It became the template for the Northwest Ordinance, which is really, constitutional historians regard the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the same year as the Constitution, as in a sense a second Constitution or an addendum to the Constitution. And what the 1784 Land Ordinance and the 1787 Northwest Ordinance did was create the bylaws for bringing new states into the Union. It began when Jefferson's Virginia ceded its western lands. At the time, they claimed land all the way through West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And they fixed their border, and they gave or yielded their western claims to the national government of the United States. And because Virginia did it, the most populated, the wealthiest, and the most powerful state, the other states were sort of forced to do it too. And then Jefferson devised the Land Ordinance of 1784, which said that new states would come in on an equal basis without being subordinated to the original 13. There wouldn't be a tiering system. Once they reached a certain trigger population, they could be territories. Once they reached a higher trigger population, they would be states. And the trigger population to become a state would be you had to have the same population as the least populated existing state. They would all have to be republics. They would have to set aside lands for schools, school lands in each state, et cetera. And so Jefferson also tried to go farther and design the size of the states and the shape of the states. He wanted every western state to be perfectly square and identical in size. That sounds zany, but it really wasn't. His idea was, you know, if you remember the Constitutional Convention, I don't want to get stuck here, but at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the fundamental issue was big state versus little state. Virginia, the biggest state and the most populated state, was at the same convention as Rhode Island. And Rhode Island didn't want to yield to proportional representation because it meant that little states like ours would always, in population, would always be overwhelmed by the great states like Texas and California and New York. And so the little states refused to stay at the table unless there were equal representation in Congress. And the big states refused to stay at the table unless there was proportional representation in Congress. And as you know, in June, the Great Compromise was created in which every state would be equal in terms of senators. Every state would get 2 irrespective of population. But there would be proportional representation in the House. And that compromise enabled the Constitutional Convention to occur. North Dakota has been one of the prime beneficiaries of that compromise. But Jefferson did all these things, and so he thought, well, we'll solve this problem. The original 13 states we can't refigure, but west of the Appalachians, we'll make every new state square, so there will never be a big state, little state geographical problem again. It didn't happen. But the states of Indiana, Ohio, Iowa are the size he wanted, but just not quite so square. But as you move west, North Dakota, virtually square, the Great Plains states, square in several respects. Colorado, Wyoming, Four Corners, where the 4 states meet in southwestern Colorado. In a certain sense, that's the most Jeffersonian place in America. The farther west you get, the more you could square up these states until you get to the coast. So he did all this planning, and North Dakota is the beneficiary of that. So establishing the state, creating the structure, defining the offices, setting the rules, establishing the institutions. Then simultaneous with all of this is struggling for economic and political independence, 1889 to 1915. And if you know your North Dakota history, I know you do, that's when Boss Mackenzie was the overlord of North Dakota. North Dakota was largely an economic colony and a political colony of Chicago banks and St. Paul railroad and mining interests. And this was coincident with the populist movement, which was going on all over the American West. Then came, in a certain sense, an extension of that, but the Nonpartisan League episode between 1915 and 1925. And Lee and I were talking about this yesterday, but if you think of famous legislators in North Dakota history, well, you think of people like Earl Strinden and so on, but the list is not that prominent. You just don't automatically think of famous legislators, but one that automatically is remembered by every school child in North Dakota is a man named Treadwell Twitchell. Treadwell Twitchell, great name, is the man who famously said in 1915, 1915, the farmers had done the constitutional work to authorize some sort of a state mill, or a terminal mill on the Great Lakes. So North Dakota was going to solve its problem of economic colonialism by owning a mill to which we could send our grain. Then we could wait for the right sort of pricing with ships on the Great Lakes. The people had authorized this, but the legislature in 1915 refused to fund what the people had authorized. And this really caused a lot of tension. And so during one of the heated sessions, there were fist fights and people were disappearing and had to be brought by sergeants of arms back to the Senate and the House. During one of these moments, Treadwell Twitchell said to the farmers who were milling about around the old Capitol, "Go home and slop the hogs." The other day I was up there and I was told to go home and fiddle on the internet, so it's the same thing. Yeah. But they said, go home, he said, "Go home and slop the hogs," and that touched off the Nonpartisan League. He later said he never said it, and maybe he didn't, but they seized upon that and they used it as their rallying cry that our elected officials are not representing the interests of the people. And that created the Nonpartisan League, and it was A.C. Townley. We became, for a period of about 6 years, the most socialist place in North America. In certain senses, we were on our way to being a Soviet. I mean, a radical farmers' self-government. Everyone knows A.C. Townley, who was the rabble-rouser who took advantage of Treadwell Twitchell's unfortunate statement. Here's A.C. Townley speaking in Crosby, North Dakota, to a huge rally. He used to fly in on airplanes, which were a brand new technology. This is one of the fruits of it, of course. This is the old Bank of North Dakota, but we got out of it a number of amazing reforms. And this is 1915 is when it was touched off. 1917, it was divided. Senate was conservative, the House was NPL. But in 1918, in the elections, the Nonpartisan League swept into power and controlled almost everything in North Dakota. And in the 1919 session, which is easily the most historically interesting session in North Dakota history, we got the Bank of North Dakota authorized, the North Dakota Mill and Elevator authorized, both still here. It created the Industrial Commission, still here. It created a state fire and tornado insurance fund. It mandated socialist hail insurance. Every farmer was assessed 3 cents per acre so that we could create a pool of money to protect your farm near Adams County or my farm in Stark County if there were hail. Grain inspection was mandated. An 8.5-hour workday for women. Workmen's compensation was begun. It authorized what became the co-op movement, beginning with mutual insurance companies. It exempted farm buildings from property taxation. It implemented a North Dakota individual income tax. A special session of that year in November ratified women's suffrage. We became the 14th state to enact minimum wage law applicable to women and minors under 18, et cetera. I mean, this was the most sweeping legislative session in North Dakota history because there was essentially a Nonpartisan League supermajority, and the governor was an NPL person. And so this is what created this the fruition of the progressive movement, even a socialist progressive movement in North Dakota. All that in one session, 1919.
Yeah. And I'm sure most people here know, but we have viewers all over the country that watch this, and it might be beneficial to know that the Bank of North Dakota is the only state-owned bank in the United States. Eric Hardmeyer is president of it. John Hoven was president of it before he became governor. And Eric Hardmeyer introduces himself as the only socialist banker in the United States. And here just a few years ago, the Obama administration completely restructured student loans. And as the Bank of North Dakota used to be really big in the whole federal student loan program, and Senator Conrad attempted to make a carve-out in the law that changed the student loans so that a state-owned bank, there's only one, that a state-owned bank could still participate in the student loans, and somebody called him on it, and he had to withdraw that. And
that mission was largely lost.
Yep.
I love this old building, this old Bank of North Dakota building. It had that beautiful incised shock of wheat. I just thought that was one of the great things about North Dakota life. But the mill is still there, and the bank is still there. Eric Hardmeyer told me the other night on an airplane that he gets a couple of calls a month from other states who think, well, maybe we want to try one of them socialist banks, but they never do. Then the league collapsed. This is the return to normalcy, a phrase coined by Calvin Coolidge when he became president in his own right in 1924. But between 1922 and 1929, after the socialist experiment, the state moved into a conservative reaction. The league collapses, and a campaign of deep criticism of the league's activities was begun by Bill Langer, a former league stalwart. The league enterprises survived, but barely, and they're allowed to languish. And the state was knowing agricultural prosperity then, and it returned to a capitalist and individualist model of production. But it tried several times to abolish the state mill and abolish the state bank, and never could quite get away with it.
Well, I was going to say, you said they survived just barely, but I think very strongly the Bank of North Dakota is one of them.
No, they survived that period when they were trying to kill them. Now they're powerful, but during that period they languished. They went into a period when they just kept their head below water to avoid being destroyed altogether. Then we come to, some few of you remember at least parts of this, the most desperate time in North Dakota history, 1929 to 1941, mere survival. I said before, 88,000 people left the state during that decade. I've talked about rural decline. Here's what's so interesting, though. The state's population peaked in 1930 at 680,845, and it has never been the same from that time until now. Here are some pictures of that. Just look at this. This was, of course, an environmental disaster in addition to being a political economic disaster.
Earlier, we were talking about the Great Depression in the state of North Dakota, and I just recommend to anybody that's interested in this topic relative to the Red River Valley. The story's very different from the pictures that we're looking at there. That's really western North Dakota. There's Gordon Morris Bakken, just a coincidence that his name's Bakken, teaches at Cal State Fullerton, and he's written a book on the Red River Valley during the Great Depression, and it's quite a different story. People were taking trips to Europe. They were really living very well on the large bonanza farms. It's just a very interesting story. We so often think about the Great Depression, we think of this, and yet in some parts of the country, including our own Red River Valley, it was very different.
Well, it rained there, and there was more capital to draw from, and so the state, that part of the state prospered at least more than the rest of the state. The current population of North Dakota is estimated at 699, 628.
It's amazing.
Which means it's actually over 700,000. So it's amazing. We have topped 700,000 for the first time in North Dakota history now. And Lynn Helms, if you agree with his estimates, said that we could go to over 1 million people in North Dakota in the next 30 years. So that whole problem that has been the most significant problem of North Dakota life, Edwin Robinson in his History of North Dakota said the too much syndrome, that we had too many homesteads, too many institutions, too many small towns, too much of everything, because we were planning for a period of growth and prosperity and stability that never came. And so since 1930 at least, there has been this fundamental dynamic problem of North Dakota life of out-migration and depopulation, now suddenly the highest population in North Dakota history. Then North Dakota's New Deal, again, Lee Calder taught me a lot about this when we talked, but the New Deal, we were so poor during the New Deal that the legislature did almost nothing because they had nothing to spend. The New Deal probably did more for North Dakota than virtually any other state. Certainly we were one of the top 5. I read that altogether, and these are using 1933 dollars, the federal government during the 10 years between 1933 and World War II poured $1.3 billion into North Dakota. That would be like 50 billion now. And at one point in 1935, 190,000 North Dakotans out of the 670, 190,000 were on direct federal assistance. You know, their salaries, such as their cash flow, such as it existed,
WPA,
CCC, farm subsidies, et cetera, but just under a third of the North Dakota people were on direct assistance from the federal government during this period. The state legislature just stood by and watched because it had no money and there was no sense of what could be done. Here are some wonderful pictures. These are WPA typists. You know, it's always a shame to call these make-work projects because the work that the WPA and these other agencies did was outstanding. This is Leith, southwest of here, WPA crew rebuilding the streets of Leith. 190,000 North Dakotans direct assistance. Bill Langer during this period was the strong man of North Dakota, former NPL guy. Now he's sort of reinvigorating his populism. He had by fiat alone, declared a mortgage holiday, a moratorium on foreclosure on North Dakota farms and small businesses. Here he is. We're moving very fast. After this, in the 7th phase of North Dakota history, the post-war conservative reaction, 1946 to 1956, Eisenhower's in power, Truman first, then Eisenhower in power. North Dakota is prosperous during this period. The farms are productive, prices are good. The North Dakota turned away from the New Deal and from the radical background of the NPL and began to be more individualistic again. Then comes the Bill Guy's era, the conservative progressive movement in North Dakota. This is one that we start to know more about because it's more recent. But with the coming of JFK and a similarly aged family, young man, handsome man, Bill Guy, the state entered a period of growth. Government restructuring. You know, when I talked to him for the film we did about him a couple of years ago for the Dakota Institute, he said that one of his proudest achievements was restructuring state government to have, accounts of purchases, to keep better tracking, to have more streamlining of government. You know, they brought modern accounting techniques to what was just kind of a haphazard system of government. Here he is, that's, by the way, him on the right. I just threw that in, Larry, because maybe you could say something about the JFK symposium that's coming.
What a segue. I like that. So November 5th through 7th, we're going to be hosting right here at this location in the Bavendick State Room a JFK symposium. And we've got our keynote speaker, Clint Hill, that many of you know about. He's the guy, if you don't know, he's the Secret Service agent that climbs on the back of the presidential limousine and pushes Jackie Kennedy back into the back seat. He is from Washburn originally. He's 82 now. He's written one book, and he's got a second one coming out in November that he will be, so he'll be doing a keynote address. Dr. Harrison Jack Schmidt, who was on the last crew, Apollo 17, is going to come and talk about JFK and the space program. And think about this, folks. The last Americans blasted off from the moon 40 years ago. Think about that. 40 years ago, we were on the moon. And now, in fact, Clay and I were on the radio the other day talking about the fact that we don't have the technology right now. It would be virtually impossible for us to go to the moon right now. We could work at it. It would take us 10 years.
Symphony will be here doing a special
we'll
JFK
Symphony.
program.
We'll
have H.W. Brands, the presidential historian. Lori Fenner will be talking about the Warren Commission. Mm-hmm. We'll have some of the leading experts on what exactly happened on the 22nd of November, and was it a lone gunman or a conspiracy? All that the 5th, 6th, and 7th of November. I just want to go back to this period of conservative reaction for a minute, because all those legislatures between 1929 and the late 40s were really very little was accomplished. I mean, they did the routine business, but very few special initiatives. But in 1947, some of you will remember, the conservatives went after the Farmers Union in that session. The co-op movement had become very important to North Dakota life, and businessmen and political conservatives tried to destroy the Farmers Union's insurance co-op that year, and nearly got away with it. And a man named Glenn Talbot was the president of the Farmers Union, and that's the year that all historians, including Robinson, say the Farmers Union became a political entity in addition to a farm co-op, that they said, we cannot survive unless we get politically organized. The co-op movement is one of the last really important manifestations of progressivism in North Dakota, and we have to protect it against this reaction. And they were able to stave it off in the 1947 legislative session. So here's Bill Guy, an extraordinary man. He gave us, of course this was federal programming, but he helped give us the interstate highway system, great growth in higher education, great growth in K through 12 education. But one area where he was particularly visionary was in value added. Remember, I said that the main issue of North Dakota life has been colonialism. We create cattle and we ship them to Chicago or St. Paul. We dig coal and we ship it somewhere else. We grow wheat or sugar beets and they leave the state. Now oil. Bill Guy said the only way to solve the problem of colonialism is to do what he called mine mouth value added. Instead of shipping the coal to Minnesota or Chicago, we'll burn it here and make power. Later, gasification. Instead of just having sugar beets here and they go to some processing plant in Iowa, we'll refine that sugar in North Dakota. And he actually went to the State Bank of North Dakota, which was in one of its moribund, quiet, low-key moods, and he said, they couldn't find funding, loans for the sugar beet plants at a price that those plants could cash flow at. And so he went to the state bank and said, why do you exist if you don't exist for this? You will fund the sugar beet plants. And he changed the culture of North Dakota by creating value added within the state, saying we're not simply going to maintain that colonialism. Art Link slowed it down a little, but he was part of that same era. Then came, almost everyone in the room will remember this, the period between 1980 and 1997, terrible drought, the collapse of the great oil boom of the 70s, and very significant outmigration and rural decline. Remember, if you remember that era, it's almost impossible not to still be affected by it. There were suicide hotlines, farm foreclosure billboards all over the state. There were all of our pastors were going off to seminars to be trained as counselors for farm foreclosure. This was one of the most desperate periods of North Dakota history. It was presided over by Governor Sinner. Second oil boom collapses, state nearly does. And what happened, Larry, was that when the oil boom collapsed, we had tied our educational funding to oil revenues. When the boom collapsed, the foundation funding for state education, for K through 12 education, plummeted. And the question then for the Sinner administration was, remember I said the most basic thing you have to do is educate your children. How are we going to do this? And he worked with a bipartisan legislature to create a tax equalization plan to stabilize revenues for education primarily. Both houses signed on to this. He signed it, and then it was referred by anti-tax activists, and the people of North Dakota in a referral rejected that bipartisan solution to this problem. When that happened, the state was essentially insolvent. It was a very dark time. I mean, the governor actually had to decide whether to put the Christmas lights on in the Capitol. You know, every year you see that tree. He actually had to make an executive decision about whether to continue lighting the Capitol because we had so little money in the state. And it was the 1989 legislature that did this, and then it was referred. And it was just a horrible time in North Dakota life. Governor Sinner worked extremely hard, and out of that, he decided that there must be desperate measures to open the state to new business, and he created a number of semi-socialist initiatives to do that. Here he is.
Before we get off this topic, I think one of the residuals of that is that when I came back in 2007, I think you came back in 6 or 5, just as the oil boom was beginning, everywhere I turned, people were saying, it's not going to last. We've been through that before. And I think that's one of the reasons, and this is just my personal opinion, that's one of the reasons why we're running catch-up trying to keep up with the infrastructure now, is because when the oil boom started, everybody was remembering the 80s and saying it's not going to last. And so there's no reason to invest in that because it's just going to have a very short run. And I think by 2010, 2011, people were realizing this is probably here to last, and we've got to build up the infrastructure. So they even had a special session of the legislature to do that.
But I would go farther with that than even you have done. I think you're right that there was deep, widespread skepticism about this boom. But what we're now figuring out is that this is not a traditional oil boom. This is different not in degree but in kind. This is effectively oil mining rather than oil drilling. They're hitting on more than 95% of all wells, some say 99%. And we know that we have the technology in place. In fact, the technology is getting better by the month. We know the proven shale reserves. It's not like looking for a pool under this table and not knowing where it is. We know exactly where it is. And so, you know, the estimates keep going up. First it was maybe up to 4 billion recoverable barrels. Then it'd be 5, maybe a little more. Now people are saying maybe 20. And as the technology improves, who knows? And so this is a more stable boom. Things could still happen, a worldwide economic collapse, a collapse of carbon prices. We have to be careful about how we fix the tax and regulatory structure, but essentially, this is not the same as those 2 previous oil booms in North Dakota. But I think, as a historian, the trauma of the 80s, when you couldn't drive across the state without seeing a suicide hotline billboard, that trauma is still with us, and I think it has effectively strangled concern about the effects of this boom. In other words, the boom has caused these great prosperity and opportunity and so on, huge surpluses. It's also caused very significant and dramatic growing pains in places like Watford City and Parshall on our roads, traffic fatalities, some spills, crime and punishment, etc. And people have been reluctant to attend to those things because the trauma of the 80s has not given us the confidence yet to say, you know what, we're sort of in a seller's market here. We can afford to be more careful about the rules of engagement. I think that the trauma is playing its last dynamics out now in a kind of a cheerleading mode that we have as a people, not just our government, but as a people for this, and that 25 years from now we will think, why were we so desperate back then? We should have been a little more cautious about the boom. So then, beginning with, as I said, George Sinner's initiatives in the last period of his governorship, and then with Ed Schaefer, the idea that North Dakota is open for business, we're going to set the tax and regulatory structure, we're going to actively work to attract business, and it's worked beautifully. John Hoeven continued it. We now are in this period, with Jack Dalrymple, and we're in this, we don't know what this one's going to be, this carbon rush, where there's almost no rational person who isn't willing to admit this is a little overwhelming. But what that means and how we manage it and how we spend the surplus and how we invest the windfall and how much money we devote to routine catching up of education, of salaries and so on, and how much money we devote to really fundamental infrastructural needs in the oil zone. Those are, I think, the main questions that are being faced by the North Dakota legislature today. Yeah. So maybe that sets up our guest.
That sets our, do you have any more? Or are we ready?
I think that might be it. Technology, that's it.
There we go. Okay. Very good.
So 1919, big session. 1947, a pivotal session. Bill Guy, during his 12 years as governor, is the most often elected governor in North Dakota history because he started off with 2-year terms. He tried to restructure the state in several ways, and he called for a constitutional convention, and it took a number of sessions to get that constitutional convention. The people rejected it a couple of times before they finally approved it. It finally occurred in 1972 and 3, and then the people of North Dakota rejected the new constitution that was drafted then. But Bill Guy was big on restructuring and resetting the state so it became a professionalised state government. So each era has to face a different set of fundamental questions.
And today well, let me back up. When Clay and I were working on the topics that we would do this year, we thought, wow, what a great opportunity. This is a legislative session year, and so we could have this historical overview that Clay has put together that was just marvelous and informational. And then we thought it would really be fun to have somebody that actually knows something about this topic come up and talk to us about the current legislative session and
how it fits.
And how it all fits into the history of it, but certainly some of his thoughts about how it's all going to play out. And we just went over, crossover was just 3 weeks ago. Excuse me. So we're really delighted. So today we have with us our Prairie Public Radio News Director, Dave Thompson, who has been saying good morning to public radio listeners in North Dakota since 1981. That would be like 30-some years, Dave. And under his watch, Prairie Public's radio service has won nearly 100 awards for news reporting. Dave is a native of Bismarck, and his hobbies are karaoke, bowling, karaoke, music collecting, karaoke. And if you haven't heard Dave Thompson sing, I understand why he enjoys karaoke, and he sings with the Civic Chorus. And so please welcome to our stage, Dave Thompson. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Welcome. So let's start this way. You've been listening to all of this, and of course, they say of reporters that they're writing the first draft of history, so you're right there watching it unfold. How do you put this legislative session into this broad matrix?
I am going to go back to something that you said early on about the oil bust of the 1980s.
Are you
Am I on?
He's on. Just a little more.
Okay.
From it. Yeah.
Just a little more. Okay. Well, basically, the first time you saw real problems was in '82, because the price of oil went down to about $5, $6 a gallon, or $5, $6 a barrel. And Alan Olson was governor at the time, and faced with this decision by the legislature to change Measure 6 in the '81 session. Let me go back. When we passed Measure 6 in 1980, it was 45% for education, 45% for general government, 10% for natural resources,
This
water.
is the extraction money.
That was the extraction money, to go from 5% to 11.5% total. In '81, the legislature, by 2/3 vote, because you can change an initiative by 2/3 vote, changed it to make it 60% to education, 30% to general government, 10% to natural resources, water.
So addicting us to oil for education.
Exactly. '82 came along, the bottom fell out of oil, and Alan Olson had to do an allocation because he didn't want to call the legislature back into special session.
What's an allocation?
An allocation saying, okay, you were appropriated this amount, but we have to pull back. So he pulled back $45 million out of education funding, and in 1982, that was pretty big money.
K through 12 across the state.
K through 12 across the state. That's all a governor can do, is an allocation is an across-the-board cut.
He's basically saying, we promised you X funds, we can't do it, we're pulling back by $45 million statewide.
Right.
It's sort of like a sequestration on a
Yeah,
state
in a way
level.
it is. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's all a governor can do without calling the legislators back. Well, jump ahead now to the 2010s, basically, and we're in a boom. We've got oil money flowing. It's a different type of boom, but you can understand why people throughout the state may have a little tinge in the back of their mind saying, what happens if the bottom drops out again? Well, the oil companies will try to assure you that because of horizontal drilling, because of all this thing fracking, the new techniques, and the fact that the technology is continuing to expand, you don't have to worry about this. This looks like a 30, 40, 50-year boom or more. So I think that in the 80s has informed what's happening here in 2013. Now legislators are convinced, hey, we've got money, we should spend on infrastructure. So there's a lot of spending on infrastructure. You've seen that in the 2009 session, the 2011 session, and in 13, it is amazing how much money is being spent on roads and bridges in North Dakota. If you're talking about just state money, it's over $1.6 billion now. And that's part of the infrastructure, and now you have to spend on, or allow some of the counties to keep the money, to spend money on schools, spend money on curb and gutter, to spend money on street lights, because they haven't had to do that before. You've got population coming in. Was talking with Gene Veeder of Watford City. He's Watford City Development Director. And the official population is somewhere around 2,000 now. He's guessing that the next census will show around 9,000. So it's huge growth. So that's what the legislature has to face right now.
And so we have this gigantic pool of money,
Right.
but a very significant portion of it needs to go right back in to make that infrastructure better, more stable, less dangerous, et cetera.
There's a bill that's going through the session that would allow the counties where there is oil being pumped out of the ground to keep more of that money in their counties for their needs. And I think, yeah, you're seeing a lot of that. But what's interesting about this session and the last couple of sessions is the intent to provide tax relief. And it's huge because we've got a property tax problem in North Dakota. Now the legislature, which legislators love to say, not all legislators, of course, would love to say, we're not in the property tax collection business, what are we doing in this business? Well, you can argue that, but they're trying to provide more money for property tax relief. Because we all remember Measure 2 last year, which was born of frustration with property taxes and how valuations are going up. Another consequence of the state's prosperity, perhaps, that property value is going up, mill levy is going up. And so they're trying to work out something that looks like it's going to be well over $1 billion in terms of tax relief, whether that be property taxes, income taxes, corporate taxes. There's all sorts of tax relief bills that are out there.
Let me be the devil's advocate here for just a second on this issue. The way I understand it is that the state government is in effect buying down the mill levy.
That's correct, yes.
So Hettinger has so many mill levies, and the state government now is providing the money so they don't have to increase, or they're buying them down so that it's not assessed against the property owners.
Right.
Okay. So what happens, just hypothetically, we all, I think, hear all the words that this boom's going to last for a long time, there's a lot of money here. What happens if oil went down to $32 a barrel overnight here? What would happen to the state, to those mills that the city of Hettinger is using to run its operations?
That, I think, is a very good question, and I know that there are people thinking about that. What happens if? Nobody is predicting that right now, but you have to keep that in the back of your mind that oil is a commodity just like wheat, and prices are volatile. So if you go that way, because what will happen is the Governor Dalrymple's preferred plan is to buy down mills that are levied for education. And instead of spending 70%, 70% state share of education, it'll be up around 80% now. And there are a lot of people who like it. There are some people who don't like it just because of the situation that you brought up. Okay. Is what happens if. Okay. But it looks like that one is a ways from being done yet. It's House Bill 1319 if you want to track it. That is going to be extremely interesting. It's in Senate Education right now. Senate Education is going to be working all this week on it, and it looks like there could be a lot of amendments to it. And that'll be one of the 3 or 4 conference committees you want to watch at the end of the session when the House and Senate get together to reconcile both versions of the bill.
Okay.
But Dave, you know, the historic question has always been, how do you generate enough revenue to do the things that a state needs to do when you have a tiny population over a wide area? That's been the historic problem of North Dakota. We're constantly trying to figure this out. Well, now we have this boom. Let's say it lasts 50 years. At some point, it does end. We can't sustain the growth. We can maybe stabilize it, but at some point, the revenues can't be sustained. Meanwhile, we're in this period of greater confidence, so we're raising salaries and we're creating new institutions and we're doing all these things, so you create a new floor of funding that has to come from state government. And we're doing what happened last time. We're addicting education and other basic services in North Dakota to money that you cannot count on being here 70 years from now. So at some point, one of 2 things has to happen. Either we have to fall back from that when we can no longer sustain it, which is what happened in those years you're talking about, or we have to diversify our economy and reach a critical takeoff point so that other things will continue to stabilize us at this level. Surely that's a debate that's going on up there.
It is a debate, and you hear a lot of people in the Democratic Party are bringing that up. They're saying, wait a second, maybe we should look ahead. What happens when the oil runs dry? To kind of paraphrase what Governor Link said, what happens when the land is quiet again? I know that there are some Republicans who feel the same way, so it's not just Democrats are leading the charge on this. Republicans are too. You had Governor Dalrymple with his 2020 initiative to look at what happens just a few years down the road, but there are people who are saying we need to look further ahead. I think the legislature right now is so obsessed with the needs that are out there, working on infrastructure, working on roads and bridges, and getting education funding straight, that you may see more of an attempt in 2 years. That's just what I'm hearing, is that there may be a lot more discussion in 2 years about what if and where do we go from here.
So try to characterize this legislative session. I know it's not easy because you're still in the midst of it and everyone's tired and we don't know how it's going to come out yet. And at a certain point you go up to the Capitol and you feel a level of fatigue and frustration that's setting in. But you've seen a lot of them, so you know they have character, that there are better and worse sessions. Can you provide some general assessment of this session for us?
What I'm amazed at this session is how many big issues have been dealt with or are being dealt with, and a few of the surprise issues that have snuck up on us. Water is, in some respects, is a surprise issue. All the fight over the Western Area Water Supply Project in the oil patch, the fight over the diversion project for Fargo, and what's happened with that. Water has been a major surprise issue, but in the 80s and 90s, what were they telling us? Water is the issue of the 21st century. We're finally getting into that, and that's going to be a huge issue toward the end of the session, too, is how you come to reconcile with spending on water projects. And it's no secret, I'm seeing the picture of Governor Dalrymple. He spoke to a group from Grand Forks who came down, and they had a Grand Forks Days of the Legislature. And he said to that group, he's concerned about this oil tax bill that Senator Dwight Cook had put in, because in 2017, what it would do is lower the tax rate on new wells from 11.5% to 9.5%. He was worried because some of that oil money goes into water project development. And he said, if they start doing that, you're going to see cutbacks in our water development. And he's convinced, many people are convinced in the legislature, that water is going to be a huge issue if you want to move the state forward and diversify the economy.
So these are somewhat surprise issues.
Yeah, it's surprisingly how much attention it's had. I think we probably should have seen it coming in 2020 hindsight when they proposed WAS 2 years ago.
Speaking of issues that people are paying attention to, what do you think about, and I'm going to bring up the easiest topic for you to talk about, Dave.
Okay.
Let's talk about abortion.
Okay.
Was that a surprise to you that all these bills have been introduced? Not only that, they've passed. Not only that, now you watch national news and they're talking about North Dakota passing the most restricted abortion bills in the country. So was that a surprise to you, and what do you think's motivating that, or what are your thoughts about that?
Well, it is kind of a surprise to me, but in some respects not, because they've tried it every 2 years. Ever since Roe versus Wade was the Supreme Court decision in 1973, there have been efforts to try to put abortion restrictions in North Dakota. A lot of them haven't gone very far. As a matter of fact, George Sinner had to veto one that I think was pretty restrictive. I think it was the personhood thing that said life begins at conception. He vetoed it in a very thoughtful veto message. Agree with it or not, it was thoughtful. He came in and said, there are disputes among theologians as to when life begins. There are people from Ignatius of Antioch who thought it was the 26th week when the soul entered the body. There are some people who think it is conception. And there are some people who think it isn't until viability, or it isn't until birth. And he said he could not do that, and he could not, at the time, subject the state to what could be a very expensive legal process. Now with the state having a lot of money, and with the whole personhood effort that's gone on in the country, I'm not really surprised that we've had the bills, but I think what is kind of surprising is that we've had about a half dozen bills, and there are some contradictions in the bills. For example, both have passed that abortion is illegal or should be illegal in North Dakota after 6 weeks. Another one that passed on Friday said abortion should be illegal in North Dakota after 20 weeks. The actual bill that said life begins at conception and making abortion an offense punishable, as a murder statute for a doctor who performs abortion, that failed. But we do have an amendment that's going to be on the 2014 ballot that is a personhood amendment for all intents and purposes. It does not specifically ban abortion. So I guess it's surprising in some respects that North Dakota is that way, we've gone into the issue as much as we can. Here's a little personal story. On Friday, and it's the crush of the day. They had these bills on Friday. So Friday afternoon, they passed some of the bills, and all of a sudden, AP sends out North Dakota bans all abortions. Immediately, Reuters is on the phone to me, NPR is on the phone to me, St. Paul Pioneer Press, Minnesota Public Radio, all on the phone to me. What is North Dakota doing up there? They banned all abortions? And I said, wait a second, let me explain what happened. AP had jumped the gun because they were still voting on the personhood amendment or the personhood bill when they jumped the gun. The good news part of that for me is I'm going to make some money from Reuters, from NPR, from Minnesota Public Radio for providing stories.
Let me ask you two questions about this, and not about abortion per se. One is, and this is, I have no preconceived notion of this, but a lot of these bills originate somewhere else. For example, on animal cruelty, or a whole range of bills are effectively boilerplate that start somewhere else, and there's a national association that's promoting this, and they circulate through all the states, and every state, many states don't have our provision. In North Dakota, every bill has to be presented to the floor and has to go through committee. So a lot of them get crushed in committee in other states. But here, they always wind up being part of the mix. But there's kind of a mill that produces these, and I'm not casting any moral judgment on it, but very few of these actually originate within the state of North Dakota. Correct. How recent is that phenomenon, and do you think it's in any way a dangerous phenomenon for legislatures?
It could be dangerous if people just introduce the bills without, at least taking time to look at what they're introducing. There has been some complaint about the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the author of a lot of legislation that's gone through North Dakota. And if I could tell just a personal story.
Of course.
I have to go back 2 years. There was an effort to do something with child care in North Dakota, okay? And West Fargo State Senator Judy Lee was part of the effort. And she had gone to ALEC, and she thought she was a member in good standing with ALEC. Well, the day the Senate was going to take up this child care bill, ALEC sends out a legislative alert.
ALEC is
the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Right.
Sends out a legislative alert saying this is dangerous legislation, vote it down. Judy Lee came to me, sought me out, and gave me one of the strongest interviews I've ever heard done, complaining and condemning the American Legislative Exchange Council for doing this. Well, I called the American Legislative Exchange Council, asked them about this, and they talked about their position that it shouldn't be a state's effort to do childcare. States should not be involved. And I said, are you going to lobby if this comes back? Quite frankly, the person on the phone, and I kid you not, I have the tape if anybody wants to listen to it, we don't lobby. Yet they sent out this legislative alert, vote this bill down, and I'm thinking, that is not how I describe lobbying. So in a way, these kind of things could be dangerous. And, okay, here's the cynic in me. These groups may have legislation that would go against a Supreme Court ruling or may be unconstitutional. They introduce those things, North Dakota passes them, guess who's left holding the bag to pay for the lawsuit? And I leave it at that.
Well,
Can you give us a good example of some of this outside interference that's actually passed and has caused problems in the state?
We'll take a look at some of the bills that have gone through on the abortion issue.
they're outside.
Yeah, they're outside the state.
But they get
Some of them are
shaped.
in,
They get
but
shaped in the
here.
state. I mean, it's not as if they're, you know. But let me ask you this different sort of question about the same thing, and it's a hard one. And I know it. You know, you're a consummate professional, and you're going to be careful. But I've seen you after 4 or 5 karaoke rounds, and you're much, much more candid. But let me ask you this question. So the state declines to protect gay and lesbians in this session.
Mm-hmm.
The state passes a series of abortion laws. We don't know whether the governor will ultimately sign them, let them pass without touching them, or veto them.
Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
That's a good point. And that's a point I really had to explain to the national media, because everybody said, he can pocket veto them, can't he?
No.
Not in North Dakota. It's a pocket assent.
He could pocket a pass.
You could pocket pass it.
But
He
you can't
basically
pocket
said,
veto.
you
So
can't.
so this is sort of, if you're looking at this from Iowa or New York, you say, well, this seems to be the mood of North Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how representative do you think this legislature is, or any legislature, of the overall mood of the state? Is it beautifully representative, sometimes representative and sometimes not? I mean, how do you assess this? I mean, does this reflect the will of the people of North Dakota, or does this reflect the will of the legislative body, or some combination?
I think it comes down to some combination. I think we can all say North Dakota is kind of a right to life, pro-life state, but you don't get the feeling that abortion is top of mind when you talk to normal voters around the state. I've done a lot of talking. I like to go to coffee shops and just sit and listen and talk with people that, you know, if you go to Steele, you go to the Coffee Cup. If you go to, there was a great restaurant, by the way, in Castleton where I like to sit and talk and listen to some of the discussion. Abortion really isn't top of mind. And I don't think it's necessarily representative. Some of the things that have gone on are necessarily representative of North Dakota. And in terms of gay and lesbian rights, I'm actually surprised it did not pass the Senate. I'm very surprised at that.
Well, let me just say a word about abortion, and then we'll move on. But, you know, I think most Americans would rather not talk about abortion.
Yeah.
That it's an unfortunate fact of life. It does happen. Roe v. Wade made it substantially legal for the first trimester. And most Americans seem to think the less said about it, the better. But I grudgingly, I guess, am sort of okay with Roe v. Wade. That seems to be the majority in polls. But in a state like North Dakota, where we have a more, as you say, a stronger right to life philosophy, which is a perfectly legitimate philosophy, when it comes up, if somebody says, well, now I'm going to make you talk about it, however much you may not want to talk about it, well, then it does sort of reflect the will of the people. If we have to talk about it, we would restrict abortion more than, say, other states would do. And so, you know, I think almost everyone in the legislature, with a handful of exceptions, wishes that these bills didn't have to come up. But once they come up, you have to vote your conscience or your politics, and the state is a right-to-life state, right?
It pretty much is. I think you're right. I think you you can characterize North Dakota as very religious, and that informs our feelings, our decisions about life, and that whole thing.
So, as far as I can tell, until such time as Roe v. Wade is reversed or chipped away at in bigger ways, these bills will continue to come.
Yes.
Because there is a substantial activist community that will never be satisfied until the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and that's their legitimate right, but they force every state to face this over and over again.
And it'll have to be something from the states probably to overturn Roe v. Wade. You know, that some of the sponsors of the abortion bills that were in the legislature were quite frank, and they were quite upfront about it, and good for them. They said, we want to challenge Roe v. Wade, and these bills are designed as a direct challenge, test cases, to Roe v. Wade.
As long as somebody's paying the bill.
Right.
Right? That's where the outsiders come in. They need to present a position, and I don't care whether the position is euthanizing cats, okay? But somebody, if they're contesting the constitutionality of the law, somebody's got to pay that bill. So outsiders can come in, promote an issue, get it passed, and then they get to walk away without paying anything. And then the state's stuck with paying the bill.
And of course, the proponents of these bills will say, well, they can file friend of the court briefs. Well, that's like kissing your sister. Let's be honest. So really, it will be up to North
I haven't
Dakota.
tried that, Dave.
Let's change the subject here. This is such a horrible subject because you know this is one of the most important subjects of all subjects, and people feel very strongly about it. And there's no illegitimate position on this or legitimate one. This is just one of those issues that you cannot help but face from time to time, and everyone squirms when you face it, I think.
Right.
But let me ask a different sort of question. Leadership. Mike Jacobs in the Grand Forks Herald this morning wrote a column saying, we need to all wish Earl Strinden were back. And he's very critical of the current leadership in the legislature, saying that Strinden, who was a very, very strong legislator for many years, handled a lot of problems behind the scenes and disciplined the legislature of both parties to focus it more clearly on what needed to be done. And he believes that the current leadership is insufficiently disciplining the legislature. What do you think? How do you assess leaders over time?
Well, it's interesting because Earl Strinden is somebody who was so far ahead of everybody else in the legislature. A guy who would work from 5 in the morning until midnight. You've got to admire his work ethic. You have to admire his respect for the process. He really respected the process. And yes, he could be very tough. He could be a very tough negotiator, but had this wonderfully wicked sense of humor. It was great to listen to him. And I will tell you that nostalgically, I miss the floor interactions between he and Dick Baucus when Dick Baucus was the head of the Democratic caucus in the House. They were the most entertaining, but it was a high level of discussion. It was really very good. And basically, Earl, we believe, and I don't think I've seen anything to dissuade me of this, he came in knowing where he was going to start, knowing when the session was going to end, and having an idea of how much money was going to be spent, what bills would be passed, what bills would fail. I think he really had an idea of that. I think that when Representative Dorso was a very strong leader too, but when Representative Dorso moved to take some of the power away from the Speaker of the House, Speaker of the House used to be responsible for appointing committees, and Dorso took that away from him and basically made the Speaker just a figurehead. I think that's when it started to be more of a one-person type thing in the House. The current leadership, well, they have their very good points. I will tell you that. But I do think that they have let it get away. And maybe that could be because of the supermajorities and some of the new people who have come in to help out, and they've got ideas, and it's a real marketplace of ideas. There's a lot of money, and the leadership's really looking at the big issues, taxes, oil, infrastructure spending, water, and then some of these other issues kind of get away from it. That's just my
It's
feeling.
fun to watch you up here because I can see you carefully crafting sentences. And I know you're not saying what you might say if we were all just alone in a room somewhere, and that's good. That's
Put a rum and Diet
professionalism.
Coke in front of me.
We admire that professionalism, but it's tough evaluating and not just reporting, isn't it?
It is. It is. But you know, we got some feelings. I think, okay, I'm going to get it for this one. I'm going to hear about it.
Let's mark the time.
The Senate leadership, to me, is much more in control of their caucuses than the House is. It's not to say that they actually control what people say on the floor, but they really have a handle about what's going on. And I'll tell you what, 2 years ago, I have to say this about the abortion issue 2 years ago. And this goes back a few issues, a few sessions. I think it's fair to say that Senator Bob Stingham, who I think was a very, very effective leader for the Republicans in the Senate.
Who died in a car accident?
He died in a car accident in Alaska. And he was a very, very effective leader. I don't think he wanted to vote on the abortion issue. So it was Senator Olofson who got the credit and also the blame when he moved to table the bill in the Senate, but I think he did that at leadership direction. And that had happened a couple of sessions previous, that leadership had gotten somebody to table the bill. So I think that Bob Stingham did not want to deal with that. He felt it was a distraction. And he felt that until we overturn Roe v. Wade, what are we doing here? And that comes from the conversations I've had with him. You know, Senator Stingham and I could have very frank conversations, but they were very friendly, and I knew where he was coming from. He was not anti-reporter by any means. He wasn't anti-public broadcasting, so we could talk. And I really do feel that, you know, he deserves a lot of the credit or blame for what happened 2 years ago.
I had a lot of respect for Senator Stingham, and I was smiling to myself when you said that, because every conversation I ever had with him was frank. Mm-hmm. He was right, direct to the point. He told you, you didn't have to guess where he was on any of the issues.
Yeah,
So.
and that goes back to the leadership in the 80s that I knew. You had Senator David Nething in the Senate. Jamestown. Yeah, no, and he was pretty straightforward. You knew where he was coming from. And you always knew where Olstern was coming from. And he didn't hide anything. And he'd go tell the minority party or the Democrats if they were, you know, split, like one session they were split, or the Republicans were in the minority, he would go tell you, and he would be right up front. This is what our caucus feels. This is what the bill's going to do.
Let me ask you, let's go to the audience here and get some questions, but go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to, you mentioned Senator Nething. This has to be the first time in 40 years that he hasn't been at a session, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, remarkable man.
And very thoughtful, and really one of the architects of the whole higher education roundtable, which is another situation that has really gotten away from everybody, and that's a
Larry
huge
knows something
issue.
about this one, I think.
I think he does.
Let's take some questions.
Yeah, does Robin have a microphone?
Yes, she
here?
does. So if you
Okay,
have-
but before we do that, I'm going to ask one more question. From a historical perspective, what's the most contentious session that you saw in your 30 years?
83 was contentious.
What was at stake?
Well, that was basically, remember, we talked about Measure 6?
Right.
And then the
collapse of
Republicans
prices.
lost the House in 82, and 83, the Democrats were in control. That was a contentious session just because the state was having trouble, you know, paying its bills for a while there. And another contentious session was 93. And can you forgive me for just a moment? 93 session. 1990, let's go back to 1992. 1992, you had a changing of the guard in elections. Remember back to 1986 when Ken Conrad defeated Mark Andrews for the U.S. Senate. 92 comes along, and remember he said he wasn't going to run again if the budget didn't balance? The budget wasn't balanced. Early in 1992, he announced he was not running for a second term. Then Representative Byron Dorgan was going to run for the second term. Well, Quentin Burdick died in office. And therefore, you had one main convention, one primary, then you had a second convention to pick the U.S. Senate candidates, and then they talked Kent Conrad into running again, so he was off his pledge, basically, that he was going to run again for a seat. But then you had a special election, and then you had the 93 session. And you're not able to see this, but public radio political reporter who has a kind of jaundiced view of things had a bunch of buttons printed up that said, "Think May." Oh. You notice I've crossed out and said June because I'm thinking that's where we are today. But think May because it was going to be a long session. Senator Dan Wagsland at the time was the head of the Democrats. Democrats had the majority in the Senate in '93. And I wore it on the first day of session. And he came up to me and said, "You are a pessimist. Gee, you don't think we're going to get our work done." And I just kind of laughed and walked away. Within a week, he was asking me for 5 copies of it.
Just to defend Senator Conrad, technically speaking, he didn't run for re-election of the seat that he had.
That he had, right.
He then took another seat, the second seat, and so that may not satisfy you, but it satisfied him.
No, I'm okay with it, okay. Just because I accept the explanation.
Right, okay.
Okay, we need to go to some questions here. We've got a microphone. If you would wait for the microphone to arrive.
On any subject.
Anything. Dave is here to answer any question that you've got today.
If you want to roast Larry. Yeah.
Or Clay.
There's one over here.
Testing. Hi, Greg Stites. I just have a quick question. I know that we all talk about, and we've all been told that there seems to be a lot of surpluses accumulating in Bismarck, and we have lots of money to spend. But I look at it in the terms of, because we haven't addressed the infrastructure needs. As a taxpayer, I don't know if we have too much money or not, because all I hear about is the fact that we have all of these unfunded needs that should be paid for through state resources from these taxes because they're a direct consequence of the people who are getting rich on the oil. I mean, I don't have any oil, but I see my property taxes, seem to be going up, and there hasn't been a lot of relief for me because the housing boom has caused my house value to go up, and so I'm still paying as much or more than ever. So when people say we have all this money, do we really have all this money? Because until you can pay the cost of having them in here extracting the oil and taking it away for profit to other people, my state's being belittled because I have all these bad roads, I have all of these bad infrastructure, I have bad water, I have increased pollution, I have all these problems that haven't been paid for yet. So what is your idea about, is anybody looking at whether or not we're actually even staying even in terms of what it's really costing the state to have this oil boom going on?
How rich are we, and what would it take to catch up?
Let's just go back to historical perspectives. I was thinking about Governor Schaefer before we came up here. And Governor Schaefer, I think it was the 2001 session, he was trying to get a $10 million general fund ending fund balance. He settled for $5 million projection because he wanted the legislature to go home. And he said that. So it's a matter of perceptions. We have 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 billion dollars in the bank. Yeah. But I think you have a number of legislators who are thinking the same way you are, and rightfully so, because there is a cost to doing business. There's a cost to having these oil companies here, and God bless them for being here. But there is a cost because of the roads are being beat up, and traffic is a problem, and all these infrastructure needs for housing. And yeah, there are people who are thinking that way, that's saying, hey, yeah, we do have a surplus, but why do we have a surplus and what should we do with it? I mean, it just can't sit in the bank and gain interest.
Let me ask it another way, Dave. If you went to the oil counties and said, add up what you need in police, daycare, infrastructure, schools, laundromats, whatever you need, tally up what you desperately need from the state government, and created that sum, whatever that sum was, from the whole oil zone. And then you added to it the fairness issue that Grafton and Grand Forks and Fargo and Wahpeton and Cooperstown are going to say, hey, wait a minute, if we're going to do infrastructural improvements, we have some serious ones too. Don't forget the equalization of the benefits. Don't just pay for the oil zone. If you add that number up, it comes to X. I'm guessing it's a huge, huge number.
It is a huge number.
And that we probably, what Greg is saying is probably we don't have enough money to pay it. That we think we're rich, but if you actually let the oil zone tell us what it needs, and you gave them what they think they need, we'd probably be bankrupt.
Or at least close to it. I think that's a fair statement, because you hear some of the counties have done some studies. Williams County has done studies, McKenzie County has done studies, and I know that there's some studies, some valley counties are doing studies about their infrastructure needs. It is a statewide problem, it's a statewide issue, and I think you're right, but things happen incrementally in North Dakota. You know, you take a step, if I could just go back to something else that you said when you were talking about the Constitutional Convention. Yeah, we defeated the Constitution, but since that time, there have been bits and pieces of that Constitutional Convention that have been put in the state constitution. The old saying is you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And that's what I think people are looking at. Yeah, there's going to be a huge influx of cash into these regions to invest in infrastructure, but are you really going to catch up? There's a point where you're going to hope to make a dent in it, and how big a dent, you know, that's remains to be seen yet. But I think that's a valid point about we may not have enough money to take care of all the needs.
No, let's talk a little bit, it kind of is related, maybe not so much, but the legacy fund. Now, that's growing, but isn't that, we've been talking about our Bank of North Dakota, it's invested through the Bank of North Dakota, which means that where we could make 28 or 30 or 35% out on the open market, it's making 1 or 2 or 3 or something through the Bank of North Dakota. Is that true or not?
What open market are you in? 30%?
Just an example.
Wow, Larry, I go see your accountant.
Well, that's true, but there are efforts now to have the legacy fund go into riskier, greater risk, greater reward investments. So that there is some effort to do that, because they realize that, yeah, 1 or 2 or 3% is not going to cut it.
We don't have to be that conservative with
Yeah.
this amount of cash flow.
Yeah.
Other questions or thoughts? There we go.
My name is Kermit Lindstrom. I'd like to all three
It's
of
not on.
There it is, here it is.
Oh.
Okay. I'd like all three of you to mention whether or not you think the new chancellor is effective.
The question is,
You weren't asking me, Kermit, right?
how do we feel about the Chancellor of Higher Education? You know, I'm going to opt out of this because I'm Larry's lackey, so you go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to say that I think that the jury is still out on it, but there seems to be a lot of people who are saying give him a chance, because he hasn't been on the job a year yet. And he was brought in by a Board of Higher Education to make some major changes. Now, I think that there are still some fundamental issues with the university system, that it is not truly a system yet. People are saying that it is not truly one system. But the new chancellor comes in with ideas. He's an outsider. He comes from California. There were some issues when he was at California. He comes in with this new pathways to success model, and people are saying, wait a second, you know, should we be moving this fast? But, you know, change is hard. And whether or not it's the right change, I think we're going to have to see that roll out. It's not completely rolled out yet. Is he doing a good job? Well, maybe he could be a better communicator. And he does have a kind of, I have some good ideas, and really you should listen to me. But I honestly think, and this is true, I cannot evaluate him until we see what pathways to success is really going to mean. I know that there have been a lot of rumor, innuendo, and if you've spent any time to the Capitol, that's an incubator for rumors. And some of the rumors that you hear about the chancellor are just, wow. You'd think he kills cats or something like that.
Let me address this historically for just a minute. There are two issues historically that I think are really fundamental here. One is that for about 12 years now, we've had instability in our higher education system. Chancellor Potts was fired in ways that are still controversial. Then Chancellor Getz was here. The perception that President Chapman was in a runaway mode and that the houses of the two presidents of the flagship universities were out of control, that some of the alumni associations and foundations were out of control. And then you had the McCallum issue and Dickinson and so on. Now you have this chancellor, he's highly controversial. There have been votes by student associations of no confidence. We see in the papers that he's brought before the Board of Higher Education to determine whether they want to continue him. A legislator offers a giant pool of money to buy out his contract, or at least to authorize that. This has been a period of considerable instability in higher education. And when you have this kind of money rolling through the state, it's a little odd that that should be so. But historically, the Board of Higher Education was created in response to the politicization of higher education by Bill Langer. And in the 30s, the state board was created to give it, like a college of cardinals or like the electoral college, some detachment from the process so that it could go about the business of educating our children with excellence and good sense without political meddling. Now the situation has been so unstable now that there is a serious move afoot to abolish the State Board of Higher Education and replace it with a department answerable to the Chief Executive Officer of North Dakota, to the governor. Historically, that would reverse what was seen as a progressive breakthrough that worked pretty well for a long time. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, that's true. And remember what happened back in the 30s when the board was created, because Langer wanted to fire some faculty at then the North Dakota Agricultural College, which is now NDSU. I could go further into that, but I think I'll shut up because I'm a UND alum. Full disclosure.
But this was designed to professionalize the system.
This was supposed to professionalize the system and prevent political meddling. Well, it was taken further when the legislature came up with the whole roundtable concept. The idea is let the colleges and universities, let the university system go, let them be entrepreneurial, let them be attracting students, let them do what they do best, and then just be accountable to the legislature. Well, there were certain legislators who just did not like that. And they want more and more accountability standards, and they look for excuses to get the legislature more involved. And there are certain legislators who do that. There are certain legislators who just say, wait a second, we have this round table, it was done in good faith, let them, run with it and see where it goes.
Larry, you were going to say?
Well, I think I should respond a little bit to this. First, there are many, many rumors, as Dave already pointed out, about the chancellor. There's terrible rumors about my job being threatened. I mean, I'll just be open with all of you. I had people stopping me at the grocery store and saying, was the chancellor going to fire you? Is that true that you were threatened? None of that is true. I've never been threatened by the chancellor. Every interaction I have had with him has been professional. He has been gracious. He has listened to me. He has asked my opinion. And so my interaction with him has been very good, very positive. But I think there's a natural tension that exists when you have the appropriators on one hand, who have to provide every penny that the system's going to spend, and then to what Dave was alluding, then you've got the independent board, on the other hand, that gets to decide how they're going to spend that. And so that just creates a natural tension. In history, we find the same thing between the King of England and Parliament. Parliament had to levy the taxes, Parliament had to provide the appropriation, and the king ran the country, and they were always at odds over that. And so I think that's what we see playing out here. We've got an independent board, and we've got the appropriators. Without the legislature, the state board doesn't have anything. And so the legislators, I think, are put in a really unenviable position, and that is that, are they not going to fund NDSU? Are they not going to fund UND? No, they're going to fund these schools because they know it's really about the future of North Dakota. As Clay's already said, the most important thing you do is educate your youth. And so the appropriators, the state legislature, is well aware of that they're going to have to appropriate that money. But there's that tension with an independent board that they don't always see eye to eye with. So.
But if this instability hadn't been in place for a dozen years, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That this chancellor was brought in as a strong, powerful person who would get things done and maybe break some eggs. And when he turned out to be just that sort of a person, some people quailed at that and thought maybe that's more centralized authority than we're comfortable with. He's also something of an empire builder. He wanted a very large set of new staff members and so on, and that has troubled some legislators.
And I will tell you that one thing about this whole idea about firing presidents came from, it may have come from a meeting, I believe it was here, and I think it was in September, when the Board of Higher Education adopted some new policies. The board did not adopt a policy that the chancellor had proposed that the chancellor be allowed to hire and fire. He does not have the authority to fire. He can recommend that that authority stays with the board, but he did recommend that he be given the authority to hire and fire.
He did.
But again, that was turned aside.
Yeah. Okay, that was a fun topic. Now, let's.
Any others?
Any other questions?
There's one back here, red shirt, 2 tables back.
I didn't know you guys had this much fun with these.
Oh, these are fun, Dave.
Yeah.
Only because of you.
Right.
Gentlemen, my name is Max Laird. My question is historical, so I'd like to roll the clock back to your original slides and ask a question that I think brings many issues forward, and how you perceive or how your historical understandings through the legislature has been handled. It's always been a question in my family, my extended family, who owns farmland in North Burleigh County, that the railroads, the Mackenzie era, were the era in which North Dakota was pretty much geographically laid out. Now, Clay, I'll refer back to your Thomas Jefferson proposals around how states were to be organized and square. And it's my understanding that the railroads had a plan similar to this relative to how far trains could travel between fuel and water and things like that. And from that developed locations where political subdivisions grew up. Towns, counties were laid out differently, and particularly school districts. And I'm just curious as to your reading through time, have you read any legislatures trying to either wrest or accept control from the railroads for some of this political subdivision? Until recent times, it's my understanding that it was left pretty much alone. And then in the 80s, Dave, you can reflect on this, when school consolidation and out-migration and small towns disappearing became an issue, I think the legislature tried to engage in this. But until that time, I don't remember any history of legislators. Was it because they were so primitive and they couldn't control? I guess that's my question. You understand it.
I can start and you can finish. Here's what little I know about this historically. The National Transcontinental Railroad Acts gave the railroads enormous amounts of discretion and property and economic incentive to complete these lines. And the Northern Pacific was the biggest beneficiary of anyone, and they owned about a quarter of the state at one time. And these were land grants given to them as an incentive to complete the system across this, at that time, almost uninhabited by white place, the Great Plains. And the technology of the time dictated how the towns would be set out, because the train needed to have water and fuel and so on at X number of stops. And so if you cross North Dakota along its main train line, which is the same as the I-94 US 10 corridor, there were towns about 1 every 10 miles. And that was created not out of a sense of utopian planning, but by the technological needs of the railroads. And if you go through the place names history of North Dakota, a very large percentage of those names are named after an engineer for the NP or the brother of the engineer for the NP. It's amazing how much the nomenclature of North Dakota was determined by that. But once you've created that corridor, which is not in central North Dakota, but in south central North Dakota, that becomes the corridor for our Transcontinental Highway 10. It then becomes the corridor for I-94. It then becomes the corridor for power lines and cell phone lines and buried cables. And so this becomes one of the main arteries of North Dakota life. Then if you add 83 and Interstate 29 and US 2, if you do a demographic study of North Dakota, the overwhelming percentage of the population of North Dakota is along those corridors. If you took all the people who live within 20 miles of I-94, 83, 85, and
Highway 2.
And 2 and 29 out, there'd be almost nothing left of North Dakota. So that's one thing that sort of determined. And I don't think the legislatures have ever really tried to do much with that, because once a town is there, once Southard is there, you try to hold on to it as long as you can. The other thing is that when the counties were created, this goes back to more of the Jeffersonian, when the counties were carved out, the idea was that any farmer citizen should be able to get to his county seat and home again on the same day. And so we have 53 counties. That's for horses and buggies. Today, you can get to any county seat in North Dakota and home on the same day. And so if we were designing the state using today's technologies, we'd probably have 7 counties or 17 counties rather than 53. But every time the state has tried to even raise the question of county consolidation, it's been overwhelmingly rejected by the people in the affected regions. Because in many places, in Sheridan County, for example, county government is the main employer in those counties. And if you took the economic engine of the county government out of that county, there'd be very little left in some of these places, and particularly before the oil boom. And so the structure had an intelligent design about it, technologically driven, and once those corridors are in place, they become super magnets, and will continue to be, I think. But have you seen legislative attention over this?
Well, there's been some attention in the 80s, and going back to school districts, I think it was George Sinner who had a proposal to have school districts cut down to, I think it was 315 at the time, to 65, if I remember my numbers correctly. That failed. Because, you know, one of the things that makes a small town, I guess you could say, the church, the school, the bar. I'm being cynical. But the church and the school for sure. But there was also a proposal to have North Dakota become 15 counties. And that didn't go very far. It didn't go through one house. It was introduced, I think, in the House, and then
What year
it failed.
was that?
I'm thinking that was 85.
But in the Bill Guy years, there was regionalization. They were trying to create regional councils that would largely take out the need for county government.
Right, there was the Regional Economic Assistance Partnership,
Right.
REAP. And, you know, in some ways, schools are a little bit into consolidation because they've got these regions where they have some centralized administration type things and some centralized way to provide some in-service training for schools, but still individual school districts have their identities. And there have been attempts every session that I can remember to say that a school district that doesn't have a high school should bond with another school district that does. That hasn't got very far either.
You know, I watched the Class B girls basketball tournament this weekend. I don't know how many of you saw it, but it was so moving. I just loved watching it. You know, you have the girls from Napoleon, and they're in Fargo. I don't know what the population of Napoleon is, but I'm guessing it's not 10,000. And you have the whole town in Fargo cheering. And I lived through the school consolidation period in North Dakota, and it was agonizing for schools to lose their high school, to lose their sports team, to lose their identity. And they fought that until collapse required them to consolidate. And every proactive governor or legislature that tried to say, let's do this rationally, was rejected overwhelmingly because
exactly.
people want to cling to that. And when you see it, when you see what it means for Napoleon to have its girls' team in Fargo, you realize how valuable that is, however much it may be inefficient. And that's really one of the tensions of North Dakota life. We've clung to the family farm when technologies and capitalism have made that a very difficult concept. We've clung to the small town school. We are North Dakotans, you said we do things incrementally. We also fight rearguard actions over and over to protect things that we regard as valuable, even when they're inefficient and costly to try to maintain.
Any more questions? Oh, got one right down here.
Here comes the microphone.
Thank you. I'm Kay Solberg-Link, daughter of Eski Solberg, which some of you people I'm sure in this room know. And I know that he was asked to be a part of the Constitutional Convention in the 70s. And if I heard you correctly, you said that they rejected it?
The people rejected it.
They did reject it, okay. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how long it took? I know that he was, of course, not in the legislature at the time, and I heard through grapevine that they said he's the only person in North Dakota who's really qualified to be a part of this, and that we needed to have him. He subsequently was petitioned into the legislature and did become a senator. He wasn't fond of politics, and so chose not to run, but he said, if the people want me, I'll do it. But I'd like to know a little bit more about the Constitutional Convention, because I was not aware that it did not, was all of it rejected?
Yeah, but as Dave says, a lot of it has been adopted in increments since, but Bill Guy was the one who pushed this. He wanted a new constitutional convention. He felt that our Constitution was outmoded and we should streamline it and we should stop amending it here and there and create one that was worthy of the modern age of North Dakota. And so the people rejected it several times before finally they authorized it, and Frank Wenstrom of Williston was the leader of the Constitutional Convention, and they adopted a set of rules that probably were mistaken. There was a lot of openness, and there was a chance for input at a whole range of moments in this process, whereas the Founding Fathers went into a room for 6 months and came out with a finished product and said, you know, take it or leave it. This process was maybe too transparent for it to succeed, but at the same time, 72 and 3, Montana was having a constitutional convention. Theirs was successful. They ratified that new constitution. It's a terrific constitution. It, for example, does two things that North Dakota has never done. It said Native Americans have to be factored into all fundamental decisions in the state of Montana, and you have to do Indian education in all schools in Montana. And that Montana became the template for that movement in the country because of what was done there. Certain things can get done at a constitutional convention that can't get done in any other way. And the second thing that they did was put in an environmental plank into the Constitution. This, of course, was at the high water mark of the environmental movement, Earth Day, and so on. And they said that every fundamental decision of the Montana legislature has to ask, what's the environmental consequence of this act? So Montana did that, and they wrestle with these questions now, but North Dakota refused. It had to do with Catholicism, with faith in part, didn't it?
Yes, it did. I remember that. And talking to Frank Wenstrom at one time when he was still in the legislature, talking with Eski Solberg, who was around, I had a chance to learn a little bit about that session. And it pains me to say this because I am an open meetings, open records, everything should be open type of guy. But that's probably one of the reasons it did fail, is because maybe it was too open. They allowed caucuses for everything. There was a pro-life caucus. They wanted to write something pro-life very strongly into the Constitution. They wanted to say something about property taxes in the Constitution. They wanted to say something about taxation power. There was a higher education statute that was all debated, and it was put on the ballot as one package.
Take it or leave it.
Take it or leave it. And we said no. But, and it would be kind of interesting, and I have not done this, and it would be kind of fun to do, is to find out how many of the ideas taken from that 71, 72 Con are now in the state constitution, because Frank Wenstrom was a leader in that, William Kretschmar was a leader in that to make sure that these constitutional changes came up, and they were approved by voters without much of a peep.
It'd be interesting to do a comparative study of Montana and North Dakota. They have a new constitution since '73. We do not. How different are the destinies of the two states because of that process?
Right.
Maybe we can go for one more question, if we have one more question.
If there were one.
If there is one more question.
Maybe there isn't.
Maybe there is.
Can I mention one more thing before
Please,
we go
Dave.
then? Just to kind of tell you about how much fun I have covering the legislature. It's because of the people, the legislators who are elected. We have a citizen legislature, and they all come with agendas, and they all come with points of view, and it's fun to hear everybody say their points of view. But I just think about some of the level of rhetoric that you hear in the legislature. And I have to go back to Elton Ringsock, who is up, and I was a high school student in Bismarck, and we'd go up to the session in '73 and '75 and listen to this. And in 1973, they were debating a resolution talking about co-ops, and especially electric co-ops. They were supporting electric co-ops, and Elton Ringsock got up on the Senate floor and said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, I just want to let you know that if it weren't for electric co-ops, you'd all be watching television by candlelight." Those are the moments you remember.
See, and I think we said there are, 6 citizen legislatures left in the country. And we're one of them.
And I love it.
Well, Dave, we want to thank you so much for being part of this. Clay, thank you for that wonderful overview that you gave us. I want to thank everyone for being here. At your tables, you have a whole agenda. Arts Quest is coming up here on our campus. It's a wonderful celebration of the humanities that goes on for a month. And I encourage you to come to all the events. I know you will enjoy them. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank our legislators that showed up today. You know, I spent 26 years in the Air Force, and often people say, well, thank you for your service. And I appreciate that they say that, but I'll bet you a lot of people don't say that to our legislators. So thank you for your service. We appreciate it. I know it's a citizen legislature, and you
Larry,
serve
don't we
us
have
well.
one more conversation too coming up?
We have one more conversation coming up.
When is it?
Mr. Jenkinson, we have one more on May 5th. On May 5th, we'll be right back here, and it is Great Conversations in History, which will include, I'm sure,
None of these, I'm sure.
So thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You were great.
Thank you, Dave.
That was great.